The topic of this lecture is moral relativism. And as you can see from the subtitle, this is another non-starter, that is, another view that isn't really going to get very far off the ground, despite some elements of it seeming initially plausible. All right, so moral relativism, first about the terminology. This is the view that morality is a product of one's culture, right? That morality has no meaning outside of a particular cultural context. And so this is often also called cultural relativism. In fact, I'd say that cultural relativism is probably the more common name for this view. Now, like subjectivism, this is really kind of a combination of two different views. I think most people sort of mush together those two things and think they're the same view, and they're really not at all the same view. Because on the one hand, it's true that cultures do say things about morality, but that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing that normative relativism would imply. So again, just to go through this, the descriptive version of cultural relativism says that, as a matter of fact, different cultures have different moral views. Okay, that's very, very straightforward, and that's the sort of thing that people think, what do you mean? Are you telling me that morality is not cultural? Well, it's cultural in that sense, that different cultures do have different moral views, perhaps. And so this is as opposed to, right, the normative view, which is that morality just is what each culture says that it is. And again, I want you to notice that these are two very different ways for morality to be a cultural thing. Right. So on the one hand, we can say, yes, different cultures have different moral views. On another hand, we would have to say that this normative claim is a claim about morality itself. Right. It says that what morality just is a cultural thing. Okay, and these are sort of two very different claims, and they stand or fall entirely independently of one another. That is, one of them might be true while the other one is false. They might both be true, or they might both be false. They don't rely on one another in any way. And so it's good not to smush them together. So the descriptive version of relativism can be used to do moral explanation. Okay, descriptive claims can do explanations. Normative claims are intended to be justifications. And so again, to illustrate the difference and to start to point you toward what is the difficulties with the normative version of this view, consider this. So if somebody grows up in the 1840s in the United States, they might not be likely to think that there's anything particularly wrong with the institution of human slavery. Notice we've explained a particular moral view that they might have, and the descriptive claim is used to sort of explain, right? Well, look, somebody's cultural upbringing might have an impact on what they think is the right thing or what they don't think is the right thing. Okay. But notice what we didn't do. We didn't justify their view. We didn't say, oh, well, look, anybody born before 1840 has a good reason to think, right, that human slavery is perfectly okay, right? I think the better way to think of it is that people who thought that slavery was okay were wrong about that, even if they did not think that they were wrong about it, or if lots of people around them didn't think that they were wrong about it either. And so again, we can provide a moral explanation, but not a justification by means of appealing to culture. Okay. So let's take a look at both of these views. Remember, with descriptive subjectivism, we thought, well, that was so obviously true that it wasn't even interesting. But this one's a little different. Although on its face, it seems to be just as obviously true that different cultures have different moral views, there's actually a bit of nuance here. And I want you to learn that hopefully will make the nuance here fairly clear. So let's talk for a minute about funerary customs. Okay, there's the customs associated with funerals and burials and paying respect to our dead. So here we have a photograph of a very recent funeral that looks at one particular funerary custom, the most common funerary custom around here anyway, very familiar to, I think, most of you, and that is burial. Okay, this is from the burial service of the American statesman John McCain, very recently passed away. But of course, not all funerary customs are the same, right? Burial isn't the only thing that people do with their dead. all the way back in ancient Greek times in the 300s BC, a Greek traveler by the name of Herodotus, who was sort of famous for traveling around in lots of different places and sort of writing down what he encountered, uh, wrote down his encounter with a people that he called the Kalatiae, or the Calatians, depending on how you want to translate that. And he said that these people practiced a form of funerary cannibalism. Okay. Now, just for terminological purposes, there's a couple of different kinds of cannibalism. You can draw a distinction between what's called exo-cannibalism, which is the eating of people outside of your social group. Usually it means killing and then eating. And so that is, for example, eating one's enemies. That's exo-cannibalism. Endocannibalism would be meaning consuming members of one's own social group, and typically that's done after members of that group have already died of some other cause, whether it be natural causes or something else. Now, it's never been the most common of funerary customs, but some cultures have used one form or another of endocannibalism as a form of funerary practice. Now, of course, you'll have to excuse this image. This is a sort of this is painted by a Dutchman named Jan van Kessel in 1644, and it's a sort of European colonial picture of endocannibalism. And so it's probably not really accurate in any real way, but it's about the only image I could find, given that I don't have any images of anything from Herodotus from 350 BC. But that's the example, is that you might imagine that this is a funerary custom that has been known to be part of the customs of at least some groups in human history, and depending on various kinds of data, perhaps even the human present. So we've seen burial, okay, and then there's of course endocannibalism. Another very common historical and current funerary custom is the burning of the body on a funeral pyre. Okay? This actually is the funeral pyre of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Back in August of 2018, he was a former and much beloved Prime Minister of India. This is his funeral. You might imagine other kinds of funerary customs that people might have in the future. So ran into this one a number of years ago and thought it was interesting. So one thing you can do with human remains once they've been cremated, okay, and so of course cremation is not exactly being burned on a pyre, but it's somewhat closer to that than it is to burial. But the one thing you can do with cremated remains of humans or animals actually is that you can put them in a special device that creates an enormous amount of heat and pressure for a few days and turns the carbon in those remains into a diamond. It's just carbon. But that's something that people have been doing with some increased frequency, especially as the costs of that technology continue to come down. And so one might imagine some future culture where people are routinely turned into, or at least portions of people's remains are routinely turned into gemstones. For example, really diamonds, because those are the carbon gems. So yeah, that could be a thing. Just a little FYI. The place where I got this particular image from is a website called inthelighturns.com, and they have this whole section about explaining cremation diamonds. And one of in the FAQ section, they say are cremation diamonds real diamonds? And so the answer, yes, of course they are. Not only are cremation diamonds real, they are eco-friendly, cost-effective, and bloodless diamonds. And I just thought that was a little interesting, given that they are in fact made out of the remains of people. Now, of course, what they mean is that nobody is worked to death mining these things out of the ground, and so that's what we typically call blood diamonds, right? Those are those sort of things. But anyway, that's what they mean. But I thought it was a little funny. All right. So given that those are all different funerary customs that cultures might have, it seems to be pretty obvious. Like people have just lots of different ideas about lots of things, and that's just one more example. Okay. But imagine, right, that we're trying to answer the question here, what is the right thing to do when a member of your society dies? Right? It seems like we've got some very different answers to that question. But instead of focusing on some of those obvious differences, let's focus on some of the commonalities instead and see where it takes us. So one thing to notice is that remains in this case are treated ceremonially, not casually, right? I mean, there's nothing, I mean, when we're burying people, we don't just toss them in a hole and cover them with dirt. I mean, that's not at all what's going on. When someone's burned at the pyre, they aren't just like, throw them on the campfire for the day, right? And that's not what's going on. Even in the case of endocannibalism, it's not just like, oh well, pass the bill, Bill's dead. No, I mean that's not the way it works. There's a ceremony involved, right? There's not the casual treatment of anybody, and that's one thing that all of these funerary customs do, in fact, have in common. Also, there's typically a big party involved, and usually food is shared. Right? This is one of those things you'll see that at funeral ceremonies the world over. Through all kinds of time, there's always a big party, and there's usually food shared at the party. And there's this great symbolism, right, of immortality and the involvement in something bigger than oneself. In the case of burial, we have marked out graveyards, right, that are there. In some sense, we're sort of keeping the body until bodily resurrection, as the Christian doctrine calls for. And then there's this notion of sort of involvement in something bigger than oneself, and the messages that people often put on their gravestones. It sort of helps to memorialize a person to people who come later, right? So there's that's there in the burial. In the case of being burned on a pyre, you've got this wonderful symbolism of the smoke rising, becoming a part of everything, and so sort of being always there, sort of being a part of something grander, rejoining the cosmos in some sense. I mean, there's all that symbolism there, and of course, some of the obvious symbolism in the case of cannibalism is there as well. The case of becoming part of the community, or the community retaining your life force, or something like that. Those are all major parts of the symbolism involved there. And of course, you've got the whole diamonds are forever thing. So there's a lot in common that these various different funerary customs have. And so the suggestion's been made that perhaps what's going on or the presence of some sort of universal moral value. And so again, just to continue with this example, think for a minute about why the elements of any funerary practice are in fact present. Right? Think about the practical things that have to be accomplished by any method of funerary custom. So one of these, of course, is to dispose of corpses. We cannot just leave people to rot. It's not safe. It's very unpleasant, but it's also really not safe. And so for the good of the community, communities of humans really do have to figure out something to do with the remains of their dead. And so that's one purpose that all of these things do serve: burning on the pyre, burial, et cetera, right? Also, one major purpose is also to console the bereaved. People are sad when their loved ones die, and that's again a kind of human universal. And so there's a need, right, to help to provide some consolation to those who survive the loss of a loved one. And also, right, we think it's important to celebrate the life of the deceased. We think it's important to show respect for our dead. And that's all of these funerary customs have in common these kinds of goals. And so this is actually one of the deepest disputes in sociology and cultural anthropology, right? Whether there is some set of values that are shared to some extent by all human cultures. Perhaps some human cultures put more emphasis in one place than another, but the idea is that they all, to some degree, have this maybe same shared set of core values, right? That's one. And when you think of it that way, it doesn't seem like a ridiculous idea. There may be a small set of very abstract core values that all human cultures have thought were important, right? That there may be this set of universal moral values. Okay. Look, I'm not a sociologist or a cultural anthropologist, and so I'm not going to be able to tell you. But of course, within sociology and cultural anthropology, there's a great big dispute, right? There's some who think of things one way, and some who think of things the other way, and that's some of their work is to try and argue which of those things is true. Like they're trying to make a better case. The only thing I'll say is that I think there are reasonable cases to be made for either view. On the one hand, it does not seem crazy to think that all human cultures have had at least some of the same universal values, some small core set of values that are common to all cultures, right? On the other hand, some cultures there are so many cultural differences that it might seem just overly silly to try and simplify things and say, oh no, there is this set of core values that all cultures share, because it seems like there are counterexamples to be found all over the place, right? And so again, I think that each of those things are they're reasonable. Okay, it's one of those things where there's a truth of the matter, but it's hard to say, right? And there are reasonable cases to be made for either of those views. And so that'll sum up the descriptive version of cultural relativism, right? Is it true that just as a matter of fact, different cultures have different moral values? Maybe not. Maybe that's not even true, but maybe it is. Right? We'll just leave it there. And turn our attention to normative relativism, which we're going to be able to give a much clearer response to. So normative relativism does not fare nearly as well as descriptive relativism does. Descriptive relativism, we were able to give a very strong maybe, and we're going to be able to do, normative relativism will not do as well as the strong maybe. And so here are some of the difficulties with relativism, and some of these difficulties will mirror some of the difficulties we saw with moral subjectivism. And starting with the view that this trouble here, that relativism basically makes culture, by definition, morally infallible. Like whatever your culture says is moral because that's all morality is just whatever your culture says it is, right? That's going to be a problem. Okay, and so one of the other troubles is that moral reasoning, right, becomes really, really bizarre. And so, really want to look at Gensler's reasoning here, right? You want to his article does a really great job of detailing some of the detailed reasoning behind some of the difficulties with cultural relativism. And so I don't ever want anyone to pretend that these lectures are a replacement for the reading in any way. They absolutely are not. But what I can do is I can point you to some of the key ideas and highlight some of the key concepts here. Okay, so think of it this way. If you've ever had to make a tough decision, right? You've wondered whether you were doing the right thing. I think everybody at some point has wondered whether or not they were doing the right thing. Okay, that's a part of the human condition. And if you've never wondered whether you were doing the right thing before, I might suggest that you ought to start wondering whether you're doing the right thing. So, if moral relativism, if cultural relativism is the right view, if that's what morality is whatever your culture says it is, well then moral reasoning really, it becomes very bizarre. In a sense, the only kind of moral reasoning that works at all is when you're wondering whether you're doing the right thing. All you should do is say, well, would my culture approve of what I'm doing? Right? What does my culture say about it? Right? And then that's it. That's literally it. That's all you can do. If your culture approves of it, it's moral. If it doesn't, it isn't. And so that seems really bizarre. It seems like that's an irrelevant question for us when we're dealing with difficult issues. When we say, oh gosh, should I stay or should I go? Should I do A or should I do B? And somebody says, well, what does your society think? And you say, well, who cares what my society thinks? I want to know what the right thing to do is. And I think that's the reaction most people have to that. So again, that's a problem for moral relativism. But also, we get the notion of cultures having no notion of moral progress or regress. Okay, so once upon a time, human slavery was part of nearly every human culture on the planet. Right? It was basically as universal as any practice ever has been. Now, it's nearly universally condemned. Right? Basically, every human culture in existence today has a problem with human slavery. Okay, and I think that to some extent, one of the things that has caused that change are in large part moral arguments from moral reformers that have eventually took hold. Eventually people run into the sort of moral force of the thing, like, well, look, what's essentially different between you and somebody else that you should get to own anybody? Right? Or imagine somebody owned you. How would you feel about it? Would you think that they had any right to do so, et cetera? And so these kinds of arguments really do sort of chip away over time in even the most culturally entrenched scenarios. And at the point where most cultures sort of end up giving up slavery and banning it, making it illegal, I think we should consider that progress. Okay? But of course, if cultural relativism is the case, cultures didn't get any better, they just got different. Right? So they were perfectly fine, like they were right when they thought slavery was okay, and they were right when they thought it wasn't okay. And so if cultures all decided to adopt human slavery again, well, they'd be right too. Okay? Again, that's very bizarre. Okay? That would be a weird consequence for cultural relativism, is that it would make no progress or regress. That is, cultures would never be able to get better or worse. But it even gets sort of more bizarre than that. When I ask rooms full of people to think of some person who, A, spoke out against the values, against the prevailing attitudes of the culture in which they lived, and who we think of as a kind of, great moral figure or moral leader, right? We think of them as being right. People come up with lots of examples, right? I mean, I think maybe the easiest one is one that Gensler uses, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Right? This is a person who absolutely spoke out against the cultural norms. The culture in which he lived was deeply racist, and he spoke out against that racism. And we think he was right to do so, and that some of the changes were made and are continued to try and be made were good. Okay, but think of it this way: if cultural relativism is true, if morality just is what every culture says it is, then moral reform is by definition immoral, right? It's immoral to question the culture in which you live, right? And that's just, again, this is a very bad consequence for cultural relativism. And so, with all of those things considered, we're going to have to basically just ditch it, right? It's such a bad view that these are problems that it can't really recover from. It's just a bad view. Okay? But I wanted to make another point here, is that if we took cultural relativism very, very seriously, we would not really be able to learn anything from other cultures. Okay, and so let's put it this way: if cultural relativism is false, right? If morality is more objective, as we'll talk about in the next lecture, whenever two cultures disagree about morality, one of them must be mistaken. Okay, and this is the good part of what cultural relativists tell us. One good thing we can learn from them is that it might be your culture that's the one that's mistaken, right? That should always be a live possibility for you. Okay, so in divorcing morality from sort of cultural teaching and sort of saying that there's two different things. Of course, cultures have things that they say about morality, but any given culture might be wrong about it. Make sure you actively think that the one that's wrong might actually be yours. Okay? And so, in order to learn something from another culture, you actually do have to reject cultural relativism, right? To say something like, well, look, my culture is getting something wrong that some other culture I think is probably getting right. In order to say something like that, morality has to be independent of culture altogether, right? There has to be something else that makes things right or wrong, not just what somebody's culture says it is. And yet, notice, we do this all the time. We learn from other cultures all the time. So, for example, people definitely criticize their own culture, and we think this is legitimate to do so. Right. For example, the cultural practice of American males putting their baseball caps on backward, I think is just unutterably stupid. And so I can criticize that as a cultural matter. But of course, one can also admire another culture, right? Say if there's something about some other culture that seems admirable and worthy of imitation. This is actually one of my very favorite things in the world. This is a few photographs from the Tokyo Lost and Found, which is enormous. And extremely well run, and there's all kinds of resources that go into it. And so, for example, on the right there, you have this photograph of their umbrella section of all these different sort of mobile carts that are just packed filled with umbrellas. The umbrella is the number one thing that gets sort of left behind on subways or on the street or things like that, and people turn it into the Lost and Found. And it's the least claimed item. People don't tend to come back for their umbrellas for whatever reason. And so they just hang on to them. They're all still there, and I think this is so interesting to me, or so sort of inspiring to me, because I think there's something about a culture where it's just so shameful to take something that doesn't belong to you, that so much effort would go into just holding on to something in case that whoever it really belongs to will come and get it, right? And the beautiful thing is that, like, if you go and you say, oh, hey, this belongs to me, and you take it, like, they don't make you prove it, right? Who would lie about such a thing, right? Again, that to me is just immensely admirable. I think that more cultures would do well to have this kind of an attitude, as opposed to a finders keepers attitude. So I don't know, that's something I feel like it's at least a kind of example about learning something from another culture. But again, consider what that requires. It requires rejecting cultural relativism, right? This idea that morality just is whatever your culture says it is, because very often we do criticize our own culture, and very often we admire others. But of course, this can go another way. We can criticize other cultures that admire our own, but of course, let's um, remains generally skeptical, right? As soon as you think you have all the right answers on everything, that's the moment at which you really stop learning anything. Um, so those are some of the difficulties with cultural relativism, and it's a bad enough view that we're just going to have to give it up. And so in the next lecture, we'll talk about the alternative to subjectivism and relativism, both of which are kind of non-starters, and that is a view known as moral objectivism. So to end this particular piece about relativism, let's talk a little bit about sort of local rules, because again, there's a kernel of truth in everything that tends to get believed. So even though cultural relativism is sort of a bad view, it's a view that's not really going to get off the ground very far, there's at least something that cultural relativists point out that does seem to matter. And the fact is that there are things like local rules. Seem to be sort of local rules of etiquette, local laws, and things like that. That there is a lot of difference around the world in one sort of thing or another. So certainly there are local rules that seem to have no direct moral value. Okay, so for example, um, drive on the right-hand side of the road. Does it really matter in some cosmic sense which side of the road you drive on? Right? Of course not. Right? I mean, as long as everyone drives on the same side, it doesn't really seem to matter. There doesn't seem to be any cosmic reason to prefer the right or the left. Okay. All right. Use the fork with your left hand. Again, why is that really morally relevant? I can't think of any reasonable way that it should be. But Gensler puts it this way. Okay, he says, look, we need to respect such local rules. Otherwise, we may hurt people, either by crashing their cars or by hurting their feelings. On the objective view, the demand that we not hurt people is a rule of a different sort, a moral rule, and not determined by local customs. So this is something I think Gensler correctly points out, that when we see all this local variation is something that it's there, and we should respect it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the rules are just equally arbitrary, right? The reason to drive on the right-hand side of the road when everybody else is so that you don't hurt people by crashing your cars into them. And the reason you follow local rules of etiquette is so that you don't hurt people's feelings. Okay, and so the command not to hurt people does seem to be a kind of universal moral claim, right? That you can tolerate some different cultural expressions of, and that's a very important distinction that Gensler does make. And so to wrap up, cultural relativism isn't going to work, and so we're left looking for other alternatives.